the Executive Director of the South African Engineers and Founders Association. I think everybody probably knows me by now. And welcome to this afternoon's Skillshare session in conjunction with Acorn Black Investments. Our speaker this afternoon is Brent Oakes. For over the past 18 years, Brent has built entrepreneurial ventures across a range of industries, held executive roles at South African listed multinationals, and founded, grown, and sold multiple businesses of his own. Brent, I know we've got a very, very busy schedule, so I'll keep it brief, but welcome and thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Once again, our host for this afternoon is Brad Wattridge. Brad, are you there?
I'm here, Gordon. I'm here, brother. How are you doing?
Right, perfect, perfect. I won't introduce you because I think everybody knows you well by now. But if I can hand over to you and Brent and take us away for the next hour.
Thanks so much, Gordon. Yeah, so we've got quite a intense discussion for the next hour, hey, Brent. I mean, I think we've got to get through quite a bit. We had a pre-chat offline about how we're going to tackle this incredibly intense subject. But then I realized very quickly that Brent really, really knows what he's talking about and will be able to kind of cuddle us and hug us as we go through this conversation to make sure that we all understand. But I think the important thing to remember is this will be made available afterwards, this document that they have prepared for us. And you can go through this in your own time and reach out to Brent, and we will share his credentials, and you can then have a follow-up conversation if you feel that a lot of this discussion today is a little bit intense. So yeah, Brent, over to you, brother. Tell us, BEE, a thing of the past. Are they voting it out now? Or what's happening, Bretty?
I don't think so, Brad. I think that if to the contrary, broad-based Black economic empowerment has been here since 2003, and if anything, the refinements make it more important to firstly gain a clear understanding as to the role it plays in your business, its importance, and more importantly, how to commercially integrate compliance to whatever level makes sense for the business concerned, and more importantly, its clients, because at the end of the day, that is why we participate, is that it's driven normally through the supply chain, and our clients ask us about our compliance strategies, and hopefully we can shed some light. You neglected to mention to the attendees that there will be a competence evaluation post. Pass mark is only 95%, and it's something about their membership fees going hand in glove with non-compliance, a surcharge being levied. So yeah, I'll do my very best. It's not the sexiest topic. It's quite legislatively loaded, but I'll do my level best to help the attendees to gain a clear understanding of why it may be important, and maybe we can deal with some concepts to demystify compliance and hopefully give them a clear path for further investigation.
Oh, that's going to be great. And I've actually gone through the presentation with you, and I think what I like about it, Brent, is it's step by step. It starts off, giving us the background and then works through it, because a lot of us probably don't know the real intricate details that we should know. As you mentioned, I mean, this is all about some policy that is going to be part of our kind of economic stratosphere for some time. And I think it's really important for us to understand exactly how this works and how do we fit into the space. But just a reminder again, Brent will make this presentation available afterwards, and you need to please reach out to them. He's a super guy. The only problem is he's from PE, but we do forgive him for that. Brent. So yeah, Brent, over to you. Botti, do you want to hit the background and take us through, and we'll stop in between if there's any questions.
Absolutely, and just bear in mind that the bustling metropolis of Port Elizabeth, or Gqeberha, is the center of the universe. I'm selling it hard. It hasn't quite caught it, but I live in home. So maybe to start off with, in terms of some background, and to your question, Brad, is it going to be amended to the point where it plays less of a role? I've made some comments and saying that it's morphing, it's changing, it's moving. But if you understand the changes that are being brought about, both historically as well as some of the proposed amendments going forward, you'll understand that it's in fact integrating further and further into allied and associated legislative pieces. So to unscramble the egg, even if the decision was to stop broad-based Black economic empowerment altogether, would take some time. But let's start at the very beginning. And the very beginning is broad-based Black economic empowerment is an elective legislation. There is no punitive measure taken against any organization that does not want to participate in broad-based Black economic empowerment. It is elective. However, there are consequences for electing not to participate. And we see this coming through strongly through the amendments brought about in 2016, in which the original BEE Act introduced this concept that the allocation of all grants, all licensing, and all concessions in South Africa, they must take a BEE consideration in the allocation thereof. So if we elect not to participate, as long as you don't need anything from government, and more importantly, as long as your clients don't require anything from government in or by way of licensing, grants, concessions, then you have very little to worry about. But in most commercial aspects of our business life, throw a stone and unfortunately you're going to hit somebody where it is meaningful to their business and its continued operations. So there has been an amendment proposed in 2026 rather. Those amendments as they stand currently have not been enacted. So they are out for public comment. All of the information that I'll be sharing with this forum will be based on legislation which is currently in play and enacted in terms of their compliance. So with that, we're going to kick into the meat of the subject. So broad-based Black economic empowerment evaluates an organization or an entity, they are referred to as measured entities, against 5 criteria. So those criteria are ownership, management control, skills development, enterprise and supply development, and socioeconomic development. In each one of these 5 statements, there are further statements or targets, and those targets are drawn by the credentials or the specific financial dynamics of each of the businesses concerned. So they are driven by headcount, they're driven by percentiles on the numbers within the business, and they articulate a numerical value either financially or by headcount in terms of the way the codes reward participation. And each of those statements then award points. So because the Department of Trade and Industry can't do maths, the evaluation is adjudicated out of 100. If you have a look at the BEE status level, 1 being the highest for a full 100 or more score, and non-compliance being under 40. And there are actually, in fact, including bonus points, 120 points on offer. In addition, there are concepts like Yes for Youth that have been introduced. Yes for Youth is about the promotion of youth, designated groups being individuals under 35, and their access to the economy through workplace experience. There are targets that can elevate compliance levels within measured entities. So in other words, you can jump up to 2 levels of compliance. So for instance, if your scorecard left you at a level 4 and you actually wanted to achieve through the strategies adopted by your business that it was important to achieve a level 2 compliance, we can engage Yes for Youth to elevate our compliance through our participation. Now, if the scorecard itself isn't difficult enough to understand through the disparate evaluation of scores out of 100 and the availability of 120 points, they further complicate our lives by dividing businesses into 3 pots. And the 3 pots is a generic organization, a qualifying small organization, and an exempt micro organization. So these are driven by the turnover thresholds within each of these businesses. So a business under the general codes would be under 10 million. A qualifying small enterprise would be more than 10 and less than 50. And a generic organization above 50 million rand revenue. In addition, the codes themselves, certain industries have promulgated sector charter codes. So for instance, the legal industry has been in the press of late, where they are challenging the legal sector charter code. So for certain industries that have been properly organized and made ministerial applications through the DTIC for recognition, they've set their own set of targets specific for their industry. Today, and not to complicate the topic further, we will be dealing solely with the general codes of good practice. Most of your membership should fall within the ambit of the measurement of these codes, save for engineering companies that specialize in the construction field. Now, in terms of compliance, I said there are 5 elements of measurement, but as when we went off to university, there were some must-pass topics in terms of our course material to attain our degrees. There are some must-pass elements of broad-based Black economic empowerment. They are identified as priority elements under the codes, and failure to achieve the sub-minimum level of compliance within these elements results in a punitive level drop. So practically, I could be mathematically achieving a level 4, but failure to achieve the sub-minimum requirement against the priority elements would precipitate me dropping 1 full level of compliance. So those priority elements are the ownership element, and specifically the net value statement within the ownership element, skills development, and then the enterprise and supplier development elements. So that's been a mouthful. I think what's important to deal with is that if we have a look at elevated levels of compliance, so if you wanted to be higher than a level 4 effective compliance status, most businesses have the ability within a typical environment to achieve between 55 and 75 points. So if we land there, we are a level 7 through to a level 5 contributor prior to discount. Now, if we don't deal with the ownership element within our business, remembering it's a priority element, this would result in a full level drop. So a level 5 becomes a level 6, or a level 7 becomes a level 8 compliant contributor status. So as I said, they're mathematically 120 points on the board, but without ownership, we would be able to score 95. But as you get closer to the top of what is targeted by element, what you'll find is the cost-benefit ratio of each of those points becomes further and further unachievable in terms of the pure economics of broad-based Black economic empowerment. So if we pause in terms of the content for 2 seconds and just consider where we placed in respect of this legislation. So as I said, broad-based Black economic empowerment is elective. We don't have to choose to do it. So why would we choose to pursue a BEE objective? Well, we might be looking for grant support in terms of our business, and there are many programs. If we wanted to apply, normally the precursor for application in this respect would be the production of a BE certificate. Or we have a customer, and that customer is using the enterprise and supply development element, and specifically the procurement component of it, which by weighting counts more than ownership, to gain their points out of their supplier base by electing to trade with them. So if I choose my supplier base correctly, and if they're correctly profiled, and if quality and pricing weren't something that I was worried about, because there are various suppliers that qualify in that respect, BE is definitely going to become a very important component of my decision-making criteria, and that's normally what happens. And the BE objective of that customer is generally driven by, if not your participation in grant licensing and or concession, it'll be theirs. So whether they're in the mining sector, automotive sector, the underpinning effect of non-compliance is exceptionally detrimental to their business cases. So if we have a look at the ownership element, the first part that's important to understand on ownership is that it's not just having a black shareholder in your business at a prerequisite or a targeted or required level to ensure point score. They are quite specific in terms of the statements within this element. So these statements detail what is required for the point allocation, and it's prorated out. So in terms of voting and economic rights, you'll see that there's a differentiation where the targeted ownership level is 25% plus one voting right. In most South African companies, there would be 100 shares in issue, so one voting right would equal 25.1%. And the economic interests tag along with the issued share capital from that business. But what most people don't understand is that there's actually the female component as well, which becomes a very important consideration. So we're going to deal with this later on, but at this stage, it's just important to note that it's not just about having a black shareholder in the business. The dynamics of that ownership play a vital role in respect of how your points are scored. There is a 10%, a 3% focus in terms of the inclusion of what they call black designated groups, which include black youth, black disabled, black rural, and 2% in terms of black new entrants, which means principally that they're not the Patrice Matsepis of the world, that they have not been engaged previously in transactions of more than 50 million rand at value at the time of their entry. And then the discounting principle within the ownership element is centrally linked to this 2.3.1 net value calculation. So net value is a concept we'll also deal with in greater detail, but the way BE was historically dealt with was that a white-owned business would sell a number of shares to a black purchaser, and they would fund or finance them in what is described normally as a vendor finance transaction. In other words, Brad, you would buy into my business, you were of color as designated by the Act, and I would essentially sell you those shares on loan account. The securities linked to that transaction was normally the return of the shares if you didn't pay me for them, considering that I loaned you the money. Or the way this was dealt with historically, contrary to the intent behind the Act, was that I would charge you an interest rate, and that interest rate, unfortunately, was so high that despite the performance of the business and you being my partner, you never truly owned the equity in the business, and we're never in a position to really gain economic entrance. So in terms of the amended codes, the introduction of the net value calculation as being part of the ownership priority element, and more importantly, the discounting factor that is attributable to that ownership element, is one of vital importance and not something that is likely to change in the near future. So without going into the detail of the calculation itself, it is impossible to achieve 40% of 8, being 3.2 points, without having at least 10% Black ownership through a flow-through methodology of recognition, according to a graduation table, which I've put on the slide, which means that either the Black person purchaser has paid for the shares, or that the dividends earned out of that business is repaid capital and interest from year 0 of the transaction to basically the 10th anniversary, seeing that the purchase price has created value in their hands to an equivalent value over a 10-year period. So now if we go into that net value calculation in greater detail, what I've outlined here is that we sold 25%, 25 and one voting right to a Black purchaser, and they essentially did this transaction at 25,100,000 Rand, and it was the ideal candidate in terms of the profile of that purchaser, being 60% Black male, 40% Black female, 12% designated group, and 8% Black new entrants. So if we look at the score under the ownership element, you'll see that all of the targets that are outlined have been achieved. But under the last statement, in terms of that net value calculation, out of 8 points, we are at 30%, resulting in a score of 2.4 points out of 8.
Sure.
By virtue of the fact that the 3rd anniversary, in terms of the net value that they were supposed to achieve by the 3rd anniversary of that transaction not being fulfilled, because there wasn't sufficient dividend flow to repay the capital and interest applicable to the transaction. In this case, this entity would achieve 19.4 of 25 points under ownership, but they would be discounted a full level of compliance by virtue of not fulfilling the priority element, and more importantly, that net value statement there within. So this is why it is vitally important when we are considering ownership as being one of the mechanisms that our businesses choose to pursue BEE compliance, and more importantly, the strategy that we're adopting to achieve a predefined outcome, that we carefully consider how we're going about it, because we don't want to find out after you've done an ownership transaction that by year 3, you've got an issue which still results in a punitive level drop and doesn't afford your business the level of contributor status that makes sense and what that you started out targeting. So in terms of ownership, what's important to understand is that it is important if you want elevated compliance. It is also important to understand what options are available to organizations. And I think that that is the main purpose of our discussion today, is that to pursue BEE compliance in the absence of ownership restricts a business's ability to pursue elevated levels of compliance. But there isn't one shoe to fit all people. So there's not one single bullet. And to start this journey, it would be vital for organizations to understand what options were available to them. So what we're going to deal with today is I'm going to go through the 5 different options, and there's actually a 6th one as well, which I'll touch on. But the 5 different options afforded within the codes and what they practically mean to an organization. They would be a flow-through principle of ownership, which is a traditional ownership transaction. The certificate says you 10% black owned because you physically sold 10% of the equity in your business to a black person, and as a result, you are 10% black owned. Modified flow-through, slightly more complicated. The principle is that where the controlling share to one ownership level lands in black hands at 51% to the extent of one ownership level, it considers that to be under black control, and therefore it counts the full value of that ownership. So principally, your certificate says 10%, but the effective black ownership is 10% times 51% being effective 5.1. Private equity, provisions covered under 3.10 of the ownership element, code series 100, and that is 4-to-1 leverage, or essentially your certificate says that you are black owned 10%, but effective black ownership actually is approximately 2.5% or less. And then we're going to deal with equity equivalence, where you're rewarded on your scorecard for black ownership, and more importantly, the throughput against the targets linked to the 25 points on offer and the priority element, but it does not involve a single share of yours being sold. So they are equity equivalent, but don't involve the issued share capital of your business. And they are comprised in two components. One is an EEIP, an equity equivalent investment program. And the second is something called the sale of asset in lieu of equity. Before we delve into this, it would be important to understand the definition of a black person is defined by this act. So they are a person of color in terms of the black African, colored Indian, or South African Chinese race designations that were resident in South Africa pre-94, i.e. prior to the inception of the new constitution. They were seeking asylum prior to that point, or they were born after 94. Those would be black African as described by the code. So Zimbabwean or any of our northern nation neighbors would not qualify, notwithstanding them being from an ethnicity perspective from an African race group. Then the types of ownership can be held either naturally through an individual, but could also be through companies, trusts, cooperatives, partnerships, employee ownership schemes, or broad-based ownership schemes. So in terms of the designation of both gender and the race groups, but gender and then the nuances between black designated groups and black new entrants, it is vital to instill the component of the 5 points that are linked to these targets, because those 5 points become important if we had to consider an ownership transaction. So I'm not going to spend too much time. This is something that the membership can read through, because the definitions are fairly simple to understand. I think where the point becomes vital is I've given you scenario A and B on this slide. And if we took two situations, so situation one, we do an ownership transaction with a black lady at 25% or at 25.1% of our business, or 25% and one voting right in the same example. And then we took a black gent, and I said that the black lady was under 35 and hadn't been privy to a empowerment transaction of more than 50 million. So in other words, they were a qualifying new black entrant, and the black gent was not only more senior, so over 35 years in age, but had been historically engaged in an empowerment transaction of more than 50 million rand cumulatively. The point differential is the important one to understand. So we're still 25% Black owned in answer to the targets articulated by the codes, but the Black gents ownership drops 18 points of 25 versus the female participant would provide the full 25-point score. So it is vital to understand when considering equity participation by any third party, if BEE is a consideration, that it would be vital that we are clear on how much reward we were going to receive if BEE was a consideration in the pursuit of that strategy. So now we're going to deal with the types of ownership. And remember, I said there are 5 options that are articulated within the codes, so within the legislation, and then a 6th option that we'll discuss as well. So flow through is a typical ownership transaction. And remember, it doesn't make a difference whether the owner themselves participates in that ownership via a trust, a employee share ownership scheme, as long as it's compliant, a broad-based ownership scheme, as long as it's compliant, or in the individual capacity for that matter. But the principle is very clear. The economic and the voting control says 10% on your certificate, because when we follow that chain of ownership, we can attach the beneficial interest to that individual in the same value. So the certificate says 10% because, in fact, we can track it back to an ultimate Black beneficiary at 10%. So that one is easy. This is where it starts becoming a little bit more confusing. So modified flow through, so your equity ratio, to all intents and purposes, the certificate says that you are 10% Black owned, but in terms of the effective equity in the Black person's hands, it's only 5.1%. So what I've done is I've detailed on the slide, if we have a measured entity that is essentially owned 25.1% by an empowerment company, and the same people that owned that measured entity prior own 49% of the empowerment company, and 51% is owned by a Black person of that empowerment company. The full 25.1% at the trading level within the measured entity is considered to be Black because the modified flow through principle has been applied, and more importantly, by virtue of its control and being applied at one ownership level, because it can only be applied once, the full 25% is recognized on the scorecard. But conversely, the effective equity at an individual level is only marginally above that 12.5%. Under modified flow through, there are restrictions. So modified flow through, in terms of recognition of ownership, can only be under the voting and economic elements, so 2.1 and 2.2 of the Ownership Code 100 series. So when it comes to the female component of recognition, when it comes to the Black designated group components of measurement, where it comes to the Black new entrant, and more importantly, the discounting factor under the net value calculations, they are all measured on the flow-through methodology of measurement and not the modified flow-through measurement. So if I give you the same example and said we've done a 10% Black ownership transaction to avoid a discount, if I apply the modified flow-through methodology of measurement, what will practically happen is the certificate says I'm 10% Black owned. But when we get to having a look at your net value calculation, remembering that it is measured on a flow-through methodology, you are only sitting with 5.1% of the equity that's recognizable against that target, and therefore you would not score high enough to prevent that less than 3.2 of 8-point discount. So I'm not sure if we can take a pause at this point and just see if the flow through and modified flow through are normally the widest used examples of ownership transactions, and open the floor for questions. Brad, it might be a good time to pause before we delve into the private equity space.
Yeah, absolutely, Brent. Thanks so much for taking us through this so far. We're 12 slides in. I'm still on slide 10, but I'll get there. I think it just takes a little bit of time, and quite honestly, I think from the outside, it picks up as complex. But once you actually get into it, as you're going through it, it's making sense. And I think the big thing for us is, my big thing is, before you enter into the space, is to have a very clear strategy of outcomes. Because I think traditionally we would see it as, okay, if you give 51% of your business away, everything will be okay. And it simply doesn't work like that. The question I have is, the complexity bothers me, because government doesn't get the basic things right. And this is incredibly complex. Do you find pushback from government with your clients, Brent? Do you have to do majority of the work and the motivation to get your clients to the levels where they want to be with government, or are they on board and prepared and ready to work closely with you?
I think that I'm going to answer your question in two parts, Brad. So I wish that our government was a perfectly run institution, and that is a dream of mine, and maybe it'll come true at some point in time. The legislation itself, I wouldn't say is as articulate as I'd like it to be to start off with. And then the implementation partners, or the resource base in terms of those seeking information, they aren't always well versed in legislation which is within their domain. So in principle, there should be no need for the skills sharing session with the membership. In principle, you should be able to knock on the door of the DTIC, being a public organization, ask them some questions, and they'd hold your hand and help you fulfill what was sought to be measured by these codes. And unfortunately, that isn't the case. In terms of clients and outcomes, I think that, to your point, being really clear on why we would want to do BEE to start off with in any business is vital. So if I understand the financial impact to my business, and we just take this completely from a unemotive perspective, right? So we're not letting emotions get involved here. We're making pure commercial decisions. Is that if I can quantify what it means to my business financially, I then can take this legislation and have a look at my compliance with a lens that there's organic compliance, what exists in my business without trying, because we trade in South Africa, right? And then the gaps. And the gaps in terms of that compliance would be additional actions or investments that I need to undertake in order to get the outcome that made sense to me. And if I took that missing link, that gap, and the various options available to me, I can cost it, I can monetize it in terms of how much it would cost. And if I look at the cost versus the benefit, then I can make an informed business decision. Qualified by operationally, it doesn't matter if the certificate's hanging on my wall that says level 1, for example, if the business fundamentally can't deliver for its clients what it set out and it was founded to do in the first place. So operational considerations are always forefront in my mind. But practically, if you intend to be a level 4, 2, 3, 1, 6, any result is possible. The only difference is that there'll be a difference between organic compliance and the compliance that your strategy speaks to achieving. Being able to cost those various actions or initiatives to get you there is easy. The biggest problem for me with clients that we've assisted historically is I can't tell you whether it's worthwhile doing. I can tell you how much it costs, but there's no guarantee that it'll yield the result that you seek it to. But I suppose in business these days, there's no such thing that a market that exists today is going to be an absolute certainty tomorrow anyway. So it's pretty in keeping.
But in a space that we're in at the moment, where there's a lot of volatility, globally and locally, Brent, and a client brings you in to consult around this process, and you're starting pretty much from the beginning with the client, do you do a risk assessment saying, look, we are prepared to do this for you. We can deliver this to you as an organization, as a company, but we need you to understand this is the risk factor. Do you sit with clients and do that?
So what we assist clients to unpack is an understanding of practically what these codes seek to measure. We specifically focus on elements of the investments that they've enacted through their business activities, promoting access to the economy, which are rewarded by these codes. They just didn't know they qualified. So they never evidenced them. So practically what I'm saying is that you do things every day within your business. Because you function in South Africa, some of those are rewarded by points. Because you didn't know they counted, you never gave it to the verification company in the evidentiary format that they require to give you the point. Because you didn't do that, you land up spending somewhere else. Okay. From an involvement of an ABI, so from Acorn Black Investments side of things, the journey of understanding the value of compliance at a different level, we leave in the individual hands of each customer because it's so subjective. If it's linked to a license, maybe it's less subjective because it's a ticket to the dance, an opportunity to trade because you require that license. If it's linked to a grant, it's also easy because you know that without that status, you cannot apply for the grant. But if you do apply for the grant and you can tick all of the other boxes, the likelihood is that you will be awarded the grant. Then it's just a question of cash flow and when those funds actually land up flowing. When it comes to the competitive advantage BEE profile represents within a business, I think it's one of subjectivity, unfortunately, is that in my view, when we are asked to offer our opinions, it's more aligned to outrunning the other person, outrunning the line, if I can put it in that adage. And why I say that is that if we take the price, which I think is paramount, and the service, which is equally important, or the product that we are producing, and I say those are the same within a competitive framework. The issue is where BE historically, and I'm saying the early 2000s, never entered the election criteria of a client's decision. Now it becomes really, really important. And it's progressively become more important to each of those clients.
Thanks so much, Brent. So we're heading into our last 15 minutes. Can you believe it, brother? Told you it goes really...
I can indeed. I can see everyone biting their fingernails and at the edge of their seats because it's such an exciting topic.
Dude, you know what? Actually, I kind of was, because this is incredible insight. I think it would be very difficult to get this kind of insight in this conversation. And I'm really quite fascinated by it. And I'm sure our audience numbers have grown. So people haven't run off and hide somewhere. But before we move into the last 15 minutes, Boetie, if Nicole can just pop your contact details down in the chat, would you be open to members reaching out to you? How would you want to work in that space?
So by virtue of the excellent job Gordon and Charlene did in telling me about the organization itself, what we've offered is that pro bono, by virtue of your membership, in terms of the attendees, we are quite happy to engage at risk. So to engage with each of the members, they just need to quote their membership with SAEFA and one of my team members, because remembering that I'm there for the glory and not for any of the hard work, would definitely be open to engaging with membership, to walking them through that practical evaluation of where you are currently, what you're aspiring to, and giving you some views in terms of unlocking that historic, unrecognized levels of compliance within the organic framework of your business, as well as giving you some insight in terms of things that you could potentially pursue to improve to whatever strategy you were trying to achieve.
Okay, fantastic. And then how would you want the members to reach out to you? Would email be okay?
Yeah, email is perfect. My contact details are on the last page of the deck
I saw that
will be shared.
Yeah.
So they can just drop me an email and I'll connect them with a member of our team.
Perfect. So that takes us, sorry, brother, you were going to say?
Yeah, but with that, I think we're going to crack on now, and I'm going to do the last section with the membership. And in terms of favored ways to answer the ownership element, there is a component here which is, in my opinion, the cheapest version that we'll deal with in greater detail in this section. So I know it's been long and it's been very info heavy, but this is the part you want to start listening to.
Perfect.
Excellent. So private equity provisions of the Act, I'm going to simplify or demystify. People have Alan Gray shares as an example. If Alan Gray was a Black-owned, Black-managed fund manager, this is what this section of the ownership element seeks to measure. Because as an investor in Alan Gray, I invest in one of their funds. As the investor, if the companies they've invested into declare a dividend, I get the money. If they sell one of the companies and there's a capital distribution, I still get the money. So what does Alan Gray get? They get a service fee for funds under management. And normally the financial services game is a beautiful one, because even when you lose someone's money, you still get paid the service fee, but they charge you. If they did what they said they were going to do, there's normally a hurdle rate saying, if I give you 10% return on your investment, I get X. And then if I give you 15, I'm taking a share of the 15% as well. And then there's normally a carry component in terms of the equity that they are investing in together with that. So to simplify it, if Alan Gray wasn't Alan Gray as a service provider, and was a Black-owned, Black-managed fund manager, I could be the investor into that fund, and the Black fund manager's criteria or credentials carry through. So the only precursor in terms of qualification is that Black fund manager needs to have a qualifying investment according to the graduation scale outlined in the net value targets. And that simplified means that if they raise 100 Rand for deployment into investing into businesses, 50 of the 100 needs to be invested in businesses that were at least 25% Black owned at the time of investment, or it needs to facilitate the entry of 25% Black ownership. But on that basis that they are a Black-owned, Black-managed fund manager, the investments are considered to be in the hands of the fund manager, in other words, Black, notwithstanding the investees that get the commercial return not necessarily being Black. So if flow-through is a one-to-one principle, modify flow through is a 2-to-1 principle. The private equity provisions of the Act afford 4 or more to 1. As the complexity grows, as there are more people in terms of the participants in the administration of the ownership, as that complexity grows, so does essentially the discount or the leverage in terms of ownership recognition. So now we deal with equity equivalents. Now remember, equity equivalents are the shares in your business remain where they are. There is no measurement in terms of the original shareholders. It is centrally focused on participation in an equity equivalent program. Most widely known is the equity equivalent investment program. A lot of your membership work within the automotive industry, so they would have heard of the ATIF. I was centrally involved with Jacob in the construction thereof. ATIF is an equity equivalent investment program. And what it says is that, firstly, qualification exclusively to multinationals that can evidence that they have an inability to cater for ownership at a local level. So in other words, they're listed on the New York Stock Exchange. All subsidiary organizations have to be wholly owned. They don't have partners anywhere else in the world. So multinationals exclusively. It's subject to ministerial approval. So you make an application to participate in an equity equivalent investment program. And then the targets are 4% of annual revenue or 25% of locally invested assets. If that number happens to be more than 100 million rand in value, as was the case with Microsoft or Dell, then it buys you out of ownership compliance. In other words, gives you the full 25 points under ownership and not having to deal with it again for up to 10 years, at which point you'll have to do it again. The next equity equivalent is for those that aren't the multinationals, or so in other words, they may be South African owned, and it's covered under the Statement 102 provisions. So the sale of asset in lieu of equity. And what it says is very simple, is that if we consider a normal ownership transaction, so let's say a business is worth 100 and we wanted to be 25.1% black owned, and there were 100 shares in, or 1,000 shares in issue, we'd sell 251 of the 1,000 shares for 25.1% of its value, circa 25.1 Rand, right? When we do that sale, we facilitated the black person's entry to the economy by inviting them to be our partner. And the value of that relative to our business is 25.1%. What they're saying under Statement 102 is, rather than facilitating that black person's entry by virtue of inviting them to be our partner, instead, if that business disposes of a division, an asset, a equity instrument equivalent in value to the shares, it's seen as if they had sold the equity. So if we take the value of a division, an asset, an equity equivalent over the value of the business, and we sell it to a black person under the terms of Statement 102, it's the same as if we'd physically sold shares from that business. And why this makes sense is it's about economic entry. So if we take my example of a business that has 100 shares in issue and is worth R1 million, and we wanted to be 25.1% black owned, we would sell 25.1% of the shares for 25.1% of the value. The purchase of those shares would have a blended right to anything that that business owned, i.e. their balance sheet. But let's imagine that this business had a property worth 251,000 Rand. If I sold the shares to that black person, they'd have an undivisible right at 25.1% to that asset, that property, at 25.1%. And what they're saying under Statement 102 is, rather than selling that black person purchaser the shares in the business, affording them access to the economy by becoming our partner, Instead, if we empower that black person purchaser through the sale of that property, that letting enterprise, the value of that letting enterprise over the value of the business, whatever that percentage, and in my example, it would be 25.1%. If we sell it to them under the terms of Statement 102, then it's the same as if we'd sold the shares. But we still own 100% of the issued share capital. Now, there are rules to Statement 102. Firstly, the asset, the equity instrument, or the division needs to be a separately identifiable sustainable opportunity. So it's got to have more than one customer, more than one supplier. There can't be rights of repurchase. There can't be any restrictions on the purchaser by way of a franchise agreement and the like. But it does represent a very real opportunity to address equity ownership within a business at a fractional cost if it isn't a organic ownership occurrence within that business. So why I say that is that if we imagine option A and option B, so if we take a pre and post view on a business, and we said that that business sold the property for 251,000 under the terms of Statement 102, what they're doing is they're taking a non-current asset on their balance sheet, they're disposing of it for full value, 251,000, and switching it to a current asset, either trade and other receivables or bank. So what's the cost? If we take a non-current asset to a current asset, it's still an asset within that business. So either the money is sitting in the bank account or the person that purchased it from us owes us the money, and when they pay us, we will have full value. So the answer is zero. And it isn't practically zero because there's a time value of money. And normally these types of transactions involve some form of assistance provided to the purchaser by way of a vendor note. So in other words, we loan someone the money, or we sell that asset or that division or that equity instrument on loan account. But practically, the cost attributable to that versus the dividend flow and the capital value foregone by selling hard equity within a business becomes a really interesting thing to investigate further. So what I've done is that I've drilled this into a practical example of how this could be achieved through a solar construct. But what's important to understand is that the ownership recognition is a product of two things: the value of the business's asset or equity instrument or division over the value of the business. So that will result in how much ownership recognition is afforded to this business as long as it complies with Statement 102. So what's important is it's completely scalable. We could result in 1%, we can result in 5%. The dynamics of the purchaser transfer because it's the same as if we'd sold shares in our business. So the dynamics being male, female, new black entrant, black designated group, whatever the profile of that purchaser is recognized on our scorecard. But the equity is still retained 100% in the original founder's hands. So in terms of a solar construct, what I've described here from steps 1 through 10 is that if we go and value our business, and then we determine that our energy component required within our business is X number of kilowatt hours, and we work out what size system we install on the roof of that business, we create a wholly owned subsidiary of our original business and warehouse that solar SPV in it. So we build the system, we value the system, we value the business, and we disposed of that solar system under the terms of statement 102 to a black person purchaser, what it would do is that on the date that we did that sale, it would confer that ownership result in our hands. Then their milestones, the first anniversary, second anniversary, third anniversary. The achievement of the third anniversary, that 40% net value, would lock those ownership credentials in our hands in the original business, the way the legislation stands at the moment, indefinitely, in perpetuity. And bear in mind what I said in terms of the cost of these types of transactions is, as long as you are achieving fair value for the asset, the cost to the original business would be nominal because it was in your balance sheet at a number. If you achieve a sale at that number, essentially ignoring the present value of that cash, there is no cost to a transaction of that nature. So with that, I've just clocked over the hour allocated. I thank the membership of SAEFA. Gordon, Charlene, Brad, and Nicole, and the team, thank you so much. In terms of the attendees, my name is Brent Oakes. As I said, you are going to have this distributed amongst the membership. If you saw some value in the presentation and or you have other questions or you would have like to have a more specific conversation regarding your business, we would welcome the opportunity. And as I said, Gordon's a taskmaster. He's negotiated a pro bono position, so for free, my favorite price. We will chat with you, set up a meeting, give you our views, and from that point, we can decide whether there might be value in exploring it further. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brent. Yeah, and I can't add much to that. That was an amazing close. Gordon, I don't know if you want to officially close the session from your side.
Thanks very much, Brad. Brent, thanks so much for giving up your time. Fascinating discussion. I like Brad was on the edge of my seat as well. So thanks so much. And thanks for giving us the presentation. We'll obviously distribute that together with your details. And yeah, absolutely. If any of the members want to reach out and take the conversation further, please do so, and we'll facilitate that with great pleasure.
Cheers all. Have a great day further.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
Cheers, Brent. Thank you. Cheers,
Thanks, Brad.
Gordon.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, guys. Bye.